Here in JavaScript keeps getting new features about arrays. And so in years 2024, a new feature called array grouping was added to the language. So now array grouping is a very powerful feature which is the name says allows us to group values in an array based on a condition. So that sounds a bit confusing, but let's make it simple in this lecture. First, let's log our moments array, reload. We have our array. And so now let's actually group these different movements by whether they are a deposit. So the positive values here are a withdrawal. So let's create a variable const. I'm giving the name grouped movements. And so that is equal. Now let's do the actual array grouping. So first of all, here we actually do not use a method, but instead we use this like write object dot group by. So this is very different from what we did earlier, where all these different array features were actually methods called an array. So here it's very important to keep in mind that we do not array grouping by doing this object dot group by. And so this now accepts two parameters. So it receives two arguments where the first one is the array, and so that is giving the name of the array moments. So then the second we need to pass in a callback function which will determine how exactly we want to group the values in the array. So basically what we want the elements to be grouped, and in order to explain this it's actually a bit easier to first write the callback and then based on the result we will see how this actually works. So basically this is a callback like all the other ones. So here I am giving the moves. So which basically loops over the array. So each of them is a movement, arrow function. So then here we can now create our group basically. So we can say that if the is greater than 0, this should belong to the deposits. So for that, let's write here deposits. So if the moment is greater than 0, then we should return this string deposits. Otherwise, we return the withdrawal string. Give it a save and then log this to the console.log grouped movements. Now let's see the reload. See here we have the deposits 5 and withdrawals 3. So first of all here we notice that we get the result as an object. So that's why here we write that object dot group by, and now this object that was created as the keys. So actually has exactly these keys that we created here. Basically we created the names of the groups. We should be created in the object and by which all the elements in the original array would be grouped. So again let's go through the callback. And keep in mind that basically this will loop over the array just like a map method or something like that. So then here for each of these elements it will return one of these two groups. So if the moment is greater than 0, then the group is should belong to the deposits. And so then this 200, this one 200, let's see, this 200 here will exactly be placed. And the same for the 450 also, and the next one is a minus 400. So then withdrawals, so this string which is then the name of the group will be returned. So the 400 will be placed into the group. So essentially here in this callback function we need to return the different group names that we want our array to be grouped by, and then each of the elements of the array will be correctly grouped into one of the categories according to our code. So it could of course by many, for example by using one or more if statements, and let's actually do that. Let's actually see that here we have the all these accounts. Okay, now see here we have that all these accounts in an array which each of them is this object here, and each of them has a movements array, and which has a different length. For example, this account has done by 5 movements and this is 8, like that. And we can classify these different accounts by the number of movements that they have made. Now let's go down and now let's create the const grouped by activity, and that is equal object dot group by. So the way we return the different category names that we want will become a bit more apparent. So here this time I am giving that we want the group of accounts array that we just saw. So for that let's write here accounts, and in that array we want the each of the accounts in that array. Account arrow function. And so here let's do a couple of operations. First of all, let's determine how many movements there actually here. So for that let's write const say that movement count, that is equal then the account dot movement dot length. And so remember that to classify these different accounts by the number of movements that they have made. So let's do that. If movement count, we can then come up with some arbitrary numbers. So let's say if the movement count is greater or equal 8, then return very active. Let's just copy sometimes. But suppose let's say that if it is greater than or equal 4, say that active. And also if it is greater than or equal 1, then return moderate. So otherwise return inactive. So basically here we have the 4 possible groups in our final object. Here see that this is the one very active, active, moderate, and account is inactive. And also here each of these accounts will be sorted into one of the groups based on the condition. So that is this condition. So let's then check the result as always. Let's log this to console, grouped by activity, reload. So here we see that we have few very active and then some are active. We have very active 3 accounts and one is active. So in this, here these 3 persons are having movements count greater than 8. And so let's check that one. See here in these 3 accounts we have greater than 8 these movements count. So here also more than 8 and then 8. So here in this Sarah's account we have only 5. So that's why this is active. And now how can we manually create these different groups and assign each of the elements in the array to one of these groups? Now but now taking it to the next level, this grouping actually makes even more sense when used with objects and the grouping simply by one of the object properties. So that's going to be one of the main use cases that you will probably use this technique with. So this object dot group by, let's then come back to our accounts array. So here in this accounts array, let's see how we could categorize all these by one of these properties. And none of them makes a lot of sense because of course we want to group these accounts by some property that is common to multiple accounts. So if we were just to group these accounts by their interest rate, for example, we would just get 4 different groups. So this doesn't make sense. We need something that multiple accounts so have actually in common. And so these are the actual groups. So instead, let's actually create one property. So that is here I am giving the type. Now let's say that these different accounts can have different types. So for example, let's say premium, standard, or basic, like that. So premium, giving premium. Now let's just copy this one and then paste here. And let's say that this account is standard. And also now this is premium. And then here, let's say that this is basic. Now we are getting all this data here from this some web API. So from some databases example, and then we want to very easy further. So groups this account different accounts simply by their type. So now it is very common to do like this. So it means that not necessarily grouping accounts by types, but simply taking one property of the objects and then grouping these different array objects into these different groups based on that. So this will make more sense once we actually go to it. Let's say grouped accounts for, let's create that const grouped accounts that is equal object dot group by. Now also give accounts again and then the callback function for each of them in an account. So for that, write here account, that is arrow function account dot type. So now let's check this console.log grouped account, reload. See that here we have premium 2 account, standard 1 account, basic 1 account. So we have here our names of the groups which in this case are actually coming directly from the type property of the objects in the arrays. And as I mentioned earlier, this is actually a pretty common use case of group array grouping. And these two are premium and then the one is standard and then one is basic. And now just to simplify this for this, which is a syntax that you will see many times, let's just copy this one and then paste. Now let's just destructure the type of account. Type. So here we also don't need this account. Now let's reload. See here we have the same result. So here you see that this is the nicer syntax. So where we have to type the less code. So array grouping really is an amazing new addition to the JavaScript language and the possibilities here are really endless. So this is all about the array grouping. See you in the next one. Thank you.